Jacob to Laban. What did I do wrong?
It was muted, isn't it, right there?
Oh, I'm sorry.
I looked at it. I thought it was unmuted, so.
All right, operator error. There's a mute button on the top. That's a telltale sign. All right. So Isaac sends Jacob to Laban. Now, if you remember, Rebekah, Jacob's mother, was from Paddan Aram, right? He was a descendant of Nahor, and so Abraham sent his servant to go find Rebekah. So now Rebekah and Isaac are sending Jacob to go find a wife from Laban, and now Laban is Rebekah's brother. And then after that, Esau says, hey, I guess it's obvious my parents don't really like my Canaanite wives, so he goes and tries to make amends, so to speak, by marrying an Ishmaelite woman. And then we see a dream. Jacob has a dream on the way to Paddan Aram or Haran. And we see that God appears to him in a dream. It's a call of Jacob, just like there was a call of Abraham, call of Isaac. And now we have God's promises to Jacob in a dream. And then Jacob arrives in Haran and he meets Rachel. He starts to live with Laban's family and works for Laban to marry Rachel and Leah. We'll talk about that story. And then he has children, and there's a big section about that. And then God gives Jacob prosperity. Jacob works for Laban for another 6 years. God blesses him. And then Jacob flees from Laban, and we'll talk more about that. Laban pursues Jacob, and ultimately they make amends, and they have a covenant of Mizpah. And that's the overview of Genesis chapter 28 through Genesis chapter 31. Any questions? Yes?
I know you don't have to cover, but I just want to mention something real quick, because you talk about Jacob stealing Esau's blessing. But in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 20, it says, by faith Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau concerning things to come. So we have to be able to harmonize that with what's going on. And I think what you can see is that certainly they did wrong in deceiving their father. But I think it's more the case like this is yet another example like we're seeing with Abraham and Sarah, where maybe some people are trying to help God out, because it's obvious that Isaac didn't want to give his blessing to the second-born son. He wanted to give it to the firstborn son, which was their tradition. But when you look at the blessings, these are prophetic utterances of what's going to happen to these people. Now, God wasn't fooled. God wasn't going to allow the prophecy that he had already given to Rebekah before the babies were even born. He told her what the outcome was going to be. So I think this is more of a case where, yeah, they did wrong, but I think it might have been more, we could add a little bit more to it. I think it might have been that there was conflict between the mother and father about who was going to get the blessing, and I think this might have been them trying to make sure that God's prophecy came about by trickery, just like Sarah tried to, used alternate means to try to bring about a son for Abraham. So I think some of that's probably tied up into that too, because when Jacob realized he had been, when Isaac realized he had been deceived, he didn't change his mind about it. In fact, the Bible says he trembled with fear. So I think he realized at that point, wow, God knew what was going on here, and I'm balking against God. And so he didn't change his mind. He didn't reverse the blessing.
So to start off with, yes, I agree. That's what we covered last week in Genesis chapter 25 through Genesis chapter 27. There's actually a verse in the New Testament that describes this perfectly well. Let's go ahead and go there. It's a good way to establish this class. We do have a ton of material, but let's go to Romans, to your point, Romans chapter 9. everybody? So Rocky's point is, hey, there's more to this, though, because Isaac is the son of the promise. Promise to who? Abraham. All right. Not only that, in Genesis chapter 22, in Genesis chapter 22, God tests Abraham with offering up the son of the promise. And Abraham passes that test. And then God makes an oath by himself that he will establish an everlasting covenant. He makes an oath. So there is a son of the promise. And in fact, James chapter 2 says that Abraham's faith was perfected at that point. And so there is a promise to this. We've been talking about that all along. But now, why Jacob and why Esau? The answer is in Romans chapter 9. Go to Romans chapter 9. And this is a long story. We talked about this last week, so we're not going to rehash this. But look in verse 10. Actually, let's start with verse 9. For this is the word of promise. At this time I will come, and Sarah shall have a son. That's establishing the promise. Verse 10. And not only this, but there was Rebekah also, when she had conceived twins by one man, our father Isaac. For though the twins were not yet born, and had not done anything good or bad, in order that God's purpose, according to his choice, might stand, not because of works, but because of him who calls, it was said to her, the older will serve the younger. Just as it is written, Jacob I loved, but Esau I hated. Before the twins were ever born, Rebekah goes to God and asks, why am I having all this problem? And God says, you have two nations in you. The older will serve the younger. And so here it says in Romans, they had done neither good nor evil. But because of the election, God had chosen. Well, God is finding his way. God's promise will happen regardless. But what we talked about last week is Jacob and Rebekah. Rebekah knew this. She held it in her heart, kind of like Mary did with Jesus. She held it in her heart and knew, but at the same time, did God need help to fulfill his promises? No, that does not justify, and we also talked about it, Jacob lied to his dad 6 times. So yes, he deceived him. Yes, he stole him. But was it always God's purpose for Jacob? Yes. All right, let's move on because we got a ton of material. All right. Let's go ahead and read Genesis chapter, I'm a little bit messed up now. Let's go back to Genesis chapter 28. In verse 10 through 22. Hey, Rocky, could I get you to read Genesis chapter 28, verse 10 through 22, please?
Verse 10, it says, and Jacob went out from, I need new glasses too, so.
Okay.
Went out from Beersheba and went toward Haran. And he lighted upon a certain place and tarried there all night, because the sun was set, and he took of the stones of that place and put them for pillows and laid down in that place to sleep. And he dreamed, and behold, I'm sorry, I know how to read.
That's fine, I'll read it.
So
That's fine.
Somebody else, I'm sorry.
Okay, and he had a dream, and behold, a ladder was set up on the earth with its top reaching to heaven. And behold, the angels of God were descending and and the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. And behold, the Lord stood above it and said, I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham, and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie, I will give it to you and to your descendants. Your descendants shall also be like the dust of the earth, and you shall spread out to the west and to the east, and to the north, and to the south, and in you and in your descendants shall all the families of the earth be blessed. And behold, I am with you and will keep you wherever you go, and will bring you back to this land. For I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you." Then Jacob awoke from his sleep and said, "Surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it." And he was afraid and said, "How awesome is this place! This is none other than the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven." So Jacob rose early in the morning and took the stone that he had put under his head and set it up as a pillar and poured oil on its top. And he called the name of that place Bethel. However, previously the name of the city had been Luz. Then Jacob made a vow, saying, "If God will be with me and will keep me on this journey that I take, and will give me food to eat and garments to wear, and I return to my father's house safely, then the Lord will be my God. And this stone which I have set up as a pillar will be God's house, and all of that thou dost give me, I will surely give a tenth to thee." Okay, so this is a continuation of the call of Abraham, continuation of the promises God gave Abraham. And so you have three columns here. In Genesis chapter 12, and then in Genesis chapter 25, or Genesis chapter 26, and then in Genesis chapter 28, which we just read, there's a call of Abraham, then there's a call of Isaac, and then there's a call of Jacob. There's a little difference here, but there's a ton of similarities. In Genesis chapter 12, God says to Abraham, "Go to a land I will show you. Leave your father's house, leave your country, go." Didn't even tell him where. But then he promises three promises. "I will make you a great nation. I will bless you, and I will make your name great." And he says, "Be a blessing." Next set of three promises. "I'll bless those who bless you, curse those who curse you, and bless all the families of the earth." We've been talking a lot about this, right? The FOTE is just shorthand for families of the earth. And then when we fast forward to the life of Isaac in Genesis chapter 26, God says, "Stay." Instead of go, he says, "Don't go to Egypt because there was a famine, but stay here." Right? And the promises were, "I'll be with you, I'll bless you, and I'll give you this land." And then there's a little bit difference. Instead of two commands, with Isaac, there was a command, "Don't go, stay here." But then there was a declaration, "I will establish my oath." And what was that oath? The oath was the oath that God took when Abraham passed the test and did not offer his son Isaac on was willing to do it, but then God held him back. So he establishes his oath with Isaac and then gives three more promises. "I'll multiply your offspring, I'll give your descendants the land, and I'll bless all the families of the earth in your offspring." Now, if you notice, there's a little bit of change in these calls from commands to declarations. Now, what we see with Jacob, with what we just read, is there's two declarations, but there's still two sets of three promises. First declaration God gives to Jacob is, "I am Yahweh, I am God." And then he promises, "I will give you this land, I will multiply your offspring, and bless all the families of the earth in you and your offspring." And then he makes a second declaration. He says, "I am with you." And there is no greater declaration. By the way, that same declaration, God says to Moses, God says to Joshua, and God says to David multiple times, "I am with you." And then there's promises, "Keep you wherever you go, bring you back to the land, and I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised." And so I want us to show this progression of these calls and how now the promise is established in Abraham and in Isaac. But now God's declaring to Jacob. So let me pause. Any thoughts on this? Go ahead, Rocky.
Other than the only way we can harmonize God being a righteous God by him pronouncing this blessing on Jacob after what he just did is to understand what we just talked about in Hebrews, where it was God's will for it to go through him in the first place. Isaac had to have known that, otherwise he wouldn't have been doing it by faith. And so Isaac was really going against God's will, and this was, because God is not rewarding Jacob for being deceitful. He's not giving him something that God got tricked out of. It was God's plan all along. They were just using wrong methods to try to achieve God's will.
That's right. That's right. God's will is because of Abraham's faithfulness. And in fact, to prove this point, let's go back to Genesis chapter 26. When God comes, so it's that middle section, Genesis chapter 26 and verse 3. This is to Isaac. This is where God's coming to Isaac. He says, sojourn in this land. Actually, right, verse 2, it says, do not go to Egypt. Stay in the land of which I tell you. Sojourn in this land, and I will bless you, and I will be with you and bless you. For to you and to your descendants I will give all these lands. And then the declaration, and I will establish the oath which I swore to your father Abraham. And I will multiply your descendants as the stars of heaven, and will give your descendants all these lands. And by your descendants all the nations of the earth shall be blessed. Now look at verse 5. Why? Because Abraham obeyed me and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws. So this is a continuation of Abraham's faith and obedience. Okay. The last thing I want to point out here is the one blessing that is consistent through them all. You notice that there's each patriarch, God's tailoring the blessings a little bit to each of them. But there's one blessing that's the same all the way through, and that is, in you or in your offspring, I will bless all the families of the earth. And we've talked a lot about this. That's pointing to who? I'm sorry? It's pointing to Jesus, that's right. And all the families of the earth are blessed through the church, which is the kingdom of God. Okay, so we already read Genesis 28:10 through 22. Why do you think the commands are replaced with declarations from one patriarch call to the next patriarch to the next patriarch? Yes.
I think this is a reminder. He's reminding them, I am God. I'm, again, like you said, I am with you, and just remember that. So it's more, here I am, rather than you're going to do this.
That's right. So Dave Bill said it's a reminder. And I think it's a reminder also. If you look in Genesis chapter 28, and when God appears to him, the Lord said, I am the Lord. This is verse 13. Look in verse 13. I'm the Lord, the God of your father Abraham, and the God of Isaac. So he's reminding them of the promise, right? The other thing is, which is what we already talked about, it's already established. It's established through God's oath by himself. And so it's not going to be due to the righteousness of Jacob. And in fact, we're going to see that Jacob, in some ways, is kind of a turkey, right? We've already seen that. But he's going to grow in his faith. We'll see that in a little bit. So what does the New Testament speak of the promises having greater fulfillment? Or how does the New Testament speak of? Well, we're behind, so I'll just answer this question. Most of the book of Hebrews speaks to this. The promises have greater fulfillment in all the nations, right? We are actually children of the promise. Through what? Through faith. What does Jacob do when he wakes up? This is another thing that's different between the calls of Abraham, call of Isaac, and call of Jacob. So Jacob has this dream. God makes these declarations and promises. What does Jacob do when he wakes up?
Memorial place.
That's right. So he takes this big stone and stands it upright. He pours oil on it. And then what does he do? Yeah, yes, he gives a if-then statement. He effectively makes a vow. He says, if God does all these things, then God will be my God, and I will give a tenth of everything to God. So he makes a vow. What do you make of that? Well, let's contrast Jacob with Abraham and Isaac. What can you say about where Jacob is in his faith journey? So we've been talking about the patriarchs for several weeks now. How would you, in contrast to Abraham and Isaac, that's right, if. I'm with you, Beth, and I think Abraham was already stronger in his faith journey. He was willing to, he doesn't even know where he's going. He's going. Now, Abraham wasn't perfect, but boy, he trusted God. Isaac also trusted God. I think Jacob hasn't quite taken on the full trust in God, even though God just appeared to him. Now, we'll see a progression in Jacob's life where he really becomes faithful over time. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, when you look at what just happened, I mean, he's leaving home because he's fearing for his life because Esau's going to kill him. Okay, so Jacob, I think, had to know because his mother knew and his father obviously knew that he was supposed to receive the blessing. And I think this is God reassuring Jacob that, yeah, I'm really going to do what I said I was going to do. And so he's reassuring him right at the beginning of his journey. So even though he was running away because he feared for his life, God's saying, I'm going to fulfill my promise anyway, because that was what I decided, and I'm going to do it.
That's right. That's what we said in the last PowerPoint page is God made the declaration, I'm going to do all this.
But I'm saying this is encouraging Jacob, that even though you're leaving under bad circumstances, I'm still going to fulfill my promise, and so that's going to help Jacob to live the way he's supposed to live.
That's right, and I think it's also, he's laying out all the things that he will do. What I'm trying to say here is Jacob at this point is given an if-then vow. I don't think he fully trusts it's going to happen. But what we're going to see when he goes to Haran, and then when he comes back, it's going to come full circle, this vow. And in fact, in Genesis chapter 35, God will remind him, and God will take him back to this very point and remind him. And at that point, we're going to see a full transformation in the faith of Jacob. But at this point, I'm with Beth, he's not complete. He's weak in his faith right now. So where in the Gospels does Jesus refer to this passage? And let me put some clarification. This is one of my favorite passages. The dream is about what? Verse 11 and 12. Verse 12. What is the dream about? Say again? No. What does Jacob see in the dream? He sees a ladder. Yep. And so we see angels ascending and descending on this ladder. And what else do we see? So we see this ladder reaching to the heaven. So angels ascending and descending between heaven, where God resides, and earth, right? Well, go to John chapter 1, verse 51. And the context for John chapter 1, verse 51 is he's calling his disciples, and Nathanael, I think it's, anyway, it's calling of the disciples, and Nathanael's sitting underneath the tree, and Jesus basically says, hey, when I saw you underneath the tree, I think it was eating an apple, and then he says, my Lord and my God, and then in verse 51, Jesus answered and said to him, because I said to you that I saw you under the fig tree, my bad, it was a fig tree, under the fig tree, do you believe? You shall see greater things than these. And he said to him, truly, truly, I say to you, you shall see the heavens opened and the angels of God descending and descending on the Son of Man. Isn't that kind of interesting? Also, Jesus says in multiple Gospels, I am the gate. All right? Some versions say I'm the door. Right? So this is the gate of heaven that we're seeing in this dream. In John chapter 14, verse 6, Jesus says, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except by me. So that's interesting, and it's kind of foreshadowing ultimately how all the nations of the earth will be blessed. Okay, let's move on. And so Genesis chapter 29, 1 through 30, I'm not going to read this whole passage just because we're way, way behind. But just going back here, in Genesis chapter 29, Jacob marries Rachel and Leah. Now, let's unpack that a little bit. Jacob arrives into Paddan Aram, or Haran, and he arrives at a well, and there's a bunch of shepherds there waiting to water their flock. And their reasoning is that they haven't done it already, is there's this big stone that they got to roll away so they can get access to the water. And they're waiting for more people to do it so they can do it together. Well, Jacob's waiting also, and then Rachel comes, who's a shepherdess, and Jacob, seeing Rachel, falls in love with her. She's beautiful. He finds out that she is Laban, who's Rebekah's brother, Laban's daughter. So what does he do? He himself rolls this stone out of the way and then waters her flock. Now, does that story of watering the livestock or the flock at a well ring a bell from a previous story? Go ahead, Ken. Yeah, great. Almost same story with Moses. Yep. That's right, Isaac and Rebekah. And I think Brother Jim Passmore did the lesson where we learned, and this is Genesis, I think it's Genesis chapter 26, about, Genesis chapter 25, where we learn about God's, he said and they met, God's covenant love and God's faithfulness. Well, one of the things that's different in this story is there, Rebekah comes to the well and she waters Abraham's servant's flock. Here, Jacob waters Rachel's flock. Now, if you remember, Abraham's servant prays before he gets there, and he says, well, at first, Abraham says, God's angel will go before you, because Abraham had faith in God. So when God sent his servant, he trusted fully that God would give a great daughter for his son Isaac. Here, Jacob's going on his own. And going back to Jacob's faith journey, I think he's taking everything in his hands. Instead of going to God and praying for a great wife, do you think Jacob knew this story of his mother? I think he knew about the story of his mother. In fact, my kids know the story about how Sandy and I met and got to know each other and how we got married, right? They know our story. Do you think Jacob doesn't know Isaac's story? Yes. Of course he knows the story of Rebekah and how Isaac got his wife Rebekah. Do you think Jacob doesn't know the story about how Isaac was almost offered as a sacrifice? Pretty sure he does. But Jacob's faith journey is not where Abraham and Isaac was. And so I think he's taking things in his own hands. And he's showing how strong he is and how hard of a worker he is. And I think he probably impresses Rachel. So then he becomes part of Laban's household. Laban likes him. And Laban says, well, you're working for me. This is great. But what will your wages be? And Jacob says, I'll work for you 7 years if you'll give me Rachel. So he worked 7 years, and it says the days flew by. It was just like a few days. And I guess when you're in love, 7 years of work, that's a lot of work. Time flies by, and that's what happens. So then 7 years is up. Jacob says to Laban, hey, my time is up. Give me my wife, Rachel. So he has this big feast and ceremony, but what happens? You guys know the story. What happens? It's Leah. So Jacob is expecting Rachel, right? But instead, Laban deceives Jacob and gives Leah his oldest daughter. And his excuse was, well, she was the oldest, and our custom is that. But the problem is, I want to skip all these questions. The problem is the agreement didn't have any contingencies. The agreement was Rachel. And so just like we saw Jacob deceive his dad, now we see, it's funny how sin kind of comes full circle sometimes. Now we see Laban deceiving Jacob. And so now he's married to Leah. He finds out the next morning. I don't know how that works, by the way. I don't know how you get married. You go to you go to your room and you can't figure out that it's Leah. But that's what happened. And so he discovers in the morning he's pretty upset. He goes to Laban, and Laban says, okay, I got it. Give Leah 1 week, and then I'll give you Rachel. So he marries Rachel in exchange for another 7 years. Now, that's interesting on a lot of levels. But one, he finishes that week, he marries Rachel, and now he has 2 wives. I'm going to skip through all these questions. So it's actually interesting, though. If you go to Genesis chapter 30, verse 27, Genesis 30, verse 27. Now, this is a little later, but it says, but Laban said to him, if now it pleases you, stay with me. I have divined that the Lord has blessed me on your account. And he continued, name me your wages, and I will give it to you. Now, this is the wages for him to work after the additional 7 years. So he works 7 years for Rachel, but gets Leah. then marries Rachel, works another 7 years, and then after this, he works 6 more years. So he is hardworking to take care of the flocks of Laban. But my reason why I think he wants to do this is because he recognizes that God is blessing Jacob. And by extension, God is blessing Laban. Okay, but I do want to say, now we get to this really awkward situation where we have almost 2 chapters of Jacob's children. We've got 5 minutes, so I'll go through this fast. We're not going to read this, but it's really interesting. For those of you who remember the story, we've got 2 women, Leah and Rachel. They're sisters. What are some interesting things that happen when they end up having 12 kids? Anybody? Is it good to have 2 wives? No. Even if they're sisters? No, it's really bad then. Really, really bad then. God always designed for, Adam and Eve in Genesis chapter 2, for one woman, one man to be married. And this is a perfect example why not to do that. Anything you guys remember? That's true. Well, I'll answer the question then, too, is incredibly competitive. That's right, Mark. They're incredibly competitive. So, interestingly, Rachel's loved, Leah's hated. But God looks upon the affliction of Leah. He recognizes she's hated. And this is a really important key concept. If you read Genesis chapter 29 and 30, you recognize that God has pity on Leah's situation. And so what does God do? He blesses Leah and closes the womb of Rachel. And so Rachel's barren. Leah has 5 boys. 5 boys, right? Well, then, after 5 boys, what happens? Rachel says, I'm barren. I've got to figure this out on my own instead of trusting God and instead of going to God like Isaac and Rebekah did, because Rebekah, his mother, was barren. He didn't go to God. Remember? Isaac went to God and asked for help with Rebekah, and God answered his prayer. Jacob doesn't do that with Rachel. Rachel tries to fix things on her own, just like Sarah tried to fix things on her own. So he says, hey, why don't you take my handmaiden as your wife? So he does. And then he has 2 children, 2 boys. Now, Leah sees that her womb is closed, so she gives her handmaiden for 2 more boys. See where this is going? Not great. But then God blesses Rachel with Joseph, and then God blesses Leah again with another boy and a daughter. So it's just really interesting. There's a weird story about mandrakes. You have to read that if you want. But it just shows you the competition and how tough of a situation this was. All right, so then God gives Jacob prosperity. There's another situation. So now he's worked 14 years. Laban goes to Jacob, hey, stay with me another 6 years. But in that time, we read that Laban changes the wages 10 times. Laban is very deceitful to Jacob. Jacob's out in the fields. While he's having children, he's out in the field, really struggling in the cold, all for Laban's flocks. But his wages were the spotted, the streaked, and the speckled. But what does God do? Every time the wages are changed on him, God blesses him. And when we fast forward to Genesis chapter 31, things are so bad between Jacob and Laban that Jacob flees from Laban. He flees with massive wealth. God answers all the fulfills all the promises that he said back in Genesis chapter 28. So he comes back into Canaan, Jacob does, but he leaves without any kind of goodbye. So Laban pursues Jacob, and he's very angry. One, I think he feels like Jacob stole from him a little bit. The word steal is used 8 times. You stole my heart is one of the things. It's translated in the ESV as tricked, but the literal is stole my heart. The meaning is you left without letting me say goodbye to my daughters. You left without letting me say goodbye to my grandchildren. And Rachel also steals his family gods. And this is a really important point for next week. Jacob's family is not fully, Jacob is learning now. And this point, in chapter 31, we see that Jacob fully understands now God has answered or fulfilled all of his promises. He brings him back to the land. He makes a covenant with Laban. He recognizes there the fear of Isaac. The first time ever used, he says, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the fear of Isaac. This is a key word. My theory of what that means is he recognizes God's fulfilled promises. What does the fear of Isaac mean? I think the fear of Isaac goes back to when Isaac was on the altar, ready to be sacrificed, and God holds Abraham's hand and says, don't touch your son. And he offers the ram. Do you think Isaac didn't tell Jacob that story? I'm pretty sure he does. Now, Jacob has realized the fear of Isaac. But his family, not yet. His family stole the gods of Laban, these idols. And so we'll talk about that next week. Thank you, everyone. Have a good day.